Well, now that's a thing that happened. Yesterday afternoon, during the Senate's confirmation of the presidential election, basically a formality, a certification of the Electoral College vote for the next president, a group of armed far-right extremists stormed into the state building, past the police, past all the guards, and into the chambers. Of course, all the senators were evacuated, and the National Guard eventually was brought in to quell the disturbance. But this is, well, it's unprecedented in modern history, and I hate that we have to keep using that word, but yeah, absolutely unprecedented since long before living memory. But actually, a better way to characterize these people are not necessarily just far-right extremists, but cult members. Adherents to the cult of Donald Trump. He basically generates this cult of personality that overrides reason in his followers, that draws out the most passionate, irrational motivations for action, that override all reason and override any sort of sense of other ways of understanding the world. Let's not mince words here. This was a coup, an attempted coup, by people who are effectively the members of a cult of personality of the current president. Donald Trump, he's a delusional man. He really does genuinely believe that he has won the election. He lives in this world where popularity and fame and adulation is the same thing as democracy. Clearly it isn't, but to him this is the way the world works. His view of reality, his worldview, is so twisted by his upbringing, by his success in business, meaning that he never has to deal with his daddy issues and never has to deal with his malignant narcissism. He has been able to wedge his way into a position of power by manipulating masses of people through these. He's basically a savant of neurolinguistic programming. So you look at a Trump rally, and he stands up there, and he basically, well, I guess he's just basically doing what I'm doing, is just talking off the top of his head. But he uses these tricks, these neurolinguistic programming tricks. He talks in triplets. He uses the rhythm of his voice, the rhythm of the syllables that he's using. It creates this resonance in the minds of the people that are listening to him. And also being in a crowd like that, like if you've been to a sporting event, I'm not much of a sports fan, but even being in a stadium with that many people that are excited about this match, like it's infectious. It really gets under your skin, and it's enlivening to the spirit. But a sports event is one thing. It's yet another thing if the President of the United States is subtly suggesting that his followers should attempt a coup. He's also very talented at saying things without saying them, where he codes in innuendo these dog whistle comments that twig to his base. If one of his followers are listening to him, they'll understand what he's trying to say, but it's ambiguous enough that it can't be pointed to definitively say. And I mean, we all recognize it, we all see it, but he's not literally saying the things that he's figuratively saying to his followers. So in this case, he's basically run this campaign since having lost the election of suggesting to people and, well, blatantly saying like, oh, this election was stolen. It was a fraudulent election, and so your duty as a patriotic American is to overturn the results of this election. Now, of course, there's been no evidence found, none at all, but by invoking patriotism, by invoking this sense of American identity, this bypasses any sort of critical reason that somebody that believed this might have, and speaks right to the amygdala, right to the core of the brain that produces the guttural responses, the aggressive responses, and And so we saw that on display yesterday. These people were very angry. They were willing to do violence, like literal violence, not just the figurative violence that they've so far mostly been doing. And so they stormed the Capitol. There were plans to hold senators hostage, conduct mock trials, do executions publicly by some of the more extreme members of this mob. It's fucking bonkers just how far these people were willing to go. Fortunately for everybody involved, they're not very good at it. It was a haphazard and shoddy coup. They brought weapons, sure, yeah, but they didn't really have the tactics to go with an effort of this kind. They surprised the police that were on the ground, because I don't really think that they were expecting these butthurt white boys to actually attempt something of this magnitude. And for that matter, the American paramilitary police complex, well, they generally treat right-wing people of this kind with kid gloves. If you compare the response to the Black Lives Matter protests this summer versus the response to what happened yesterday, it's like night and day. During the protests this summer, there was like the actual military was brought in, people who were armed with lethal weaponry, and also firing less lethal weaponry at innocent civilians who have not done any actual violence. And I, to note here, committing property damage, that's not violence. That's property damage. Damage to a human being is violence. On the surface, there may be some similarities that someone who doesn't know better might draw between the tactics of the left and the tactics of these folks, and the behaviors of both. But there's actually very little in common. It's mostly just the surface thing, the form of it, that there are a bunch of angry people who are willing to take matters into their own hands. If we look at the Black Lives Matter and Antifa protests from the summer, we see a distributed, decentralized group of people acting with affinity groups, so not by a centralized hierarchy, acting against authority. So it's often a misconception that Antifa is some organization with like leadership and funding and marching orders and a centralized command, but it ain't. Antifa is an ideology rather than an organization. Antifa literally just means anti-fascist. So I am Antifa. I don't like fascists. Anything that goes along with fascism, I do not like this. Therefore, I am Antifa. And there's many ways to be Antifa. One can be a completely passive Antifa. One can simply be a supporter. One can just show up to rallies and make demonstrations. One can make videos on the internet. One can do any number of different things to support something. What you see on TV as those Antifa thugs or whatever, those are the people that are the actual warriors of Antifa, the so-called Antifa super soldiers. But they're not being commanded by anyone. Antifa is an anti-authoritarian, decentralized ideology. So there is no marching orders. Everyone, every single individual is acting on their own, of their own accord. And of course there is some collaboration, there is some teamwork and also some negotiation, but it's a constant process of negotiation between the people that are involved in any given operation. On the other hand, the folks that showed up yesterday, they're very much authoritarian. They're very hierarchical in nature. And so they've got this big man at the top, the guy with the orange hair that's in the White House now, that has subtly suggested that they should attempt a coup. And so he is giving the orders. But they also have hierarchies. They have top figures within their organization that are giving marching orders to everyone below. This is not a grassroots movement as with BLM or Antifa. This is an astroturf movement. I guess unsurprisingly, on the internet in a few places, and I actually had somebody ask me about this yesterday, whether Antifa is involved in what happened yesterday, whether it be like secret Antifa people doing a false flag operation, or there's some overlap between Antifa and the Proud Boys. By the very definition of who these people are, that would be impossible. Because as I said before, Antifa means anti-fascist, so they're anti-authoritarian and anti-chauvinist by nature. Proud Boys, on the other hand, are chauvinist authoritarians. So nobody who would do anything with Antifa, who has an Antifa ideology, would want anything to do with the Proud Boys. And in fact, oftentimes these two groups are butting heads quite strenuously. If anything, influential people on the left were strenuously encouraging other folks on the left just don't get involved. Because, as it might be said from The Art of War, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a terrible mistake. And this was a terrible mistake. There is, though, a way where these things do interact. There's a boogaloo movement going on, referring to Civil War II electric boogaloo. These are a group of accelerationists, and an accelerationist is basically somebody that wants to accelerate the chaos in society so that it precipitates a dramatic event, a collapse event, so that there can be a greater conflict between the different factions of extremist politics. These folks, they kind of cross the political spectrum in a way. There are left accelerationists, people who want to see the status quo collapse in order to bring about a more equitable world. But then there's also right accelerationists who want to see the status quo collapse so that democracy is no longer a thing, so that they can have a more authoritarian world. It's somewhat tempting at times to be an accelerationist, and I flirt with the idea of left accelerationism from time to time. But on the other hand, if things collapse, it's probably not going to turn out very well for us. For one thing, it's mostly the people at the bottom who suffer from a collapse of that degree, of that nature. Our mothers, our grandmothers, those of us who are disabled, or especially those who are impoverished, they're not going to fare very well when the support systems of our current government just suddenly isn't there anymore, and there's fighting in the streets. It seems really exciting and adventurous that, oh, hey, we're going to have a civil war, we're going to have riots in the streets, but when the bullets start flying and the phones go down and nobody knows what the fuck's going on, it's actually going to be kind of scary. I don't want that. I would really rather prefer a nice, slow and subtle transition to a more equitable world. I'll talk a bit more about the difference between incrementalism and like revolutionary politics later, but I tend to fall on that scale, on that spectrum, on the level of, yes, we need fundamental change to the way our society operates, but I would rather it not collapse in the process of doing so. What's really dangerous about this boogaloo movement is that it sets one side off against the other. These boogaloo movement folks are stoking the fires behind both left extremists as well as right extremists, so that they're brought into conflict with the forces of the status quo, the current government, the law enforcement, etc. You may note that the Proud Boys, at first, back in the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer, they were hell-bent on supporting the police. They're the thin blue line folks. They're the folks that are all law and order and showed up to a used car lot with an assault rifle to defend law and order. But now all of a sudden they're in conflict with the police. They've switched sides, but not really, actually. They're still the same hierarchical chauvinist folks who support this authoritarian figurehead, this cult of personality. But suddenly the establishment, the status quo, no longer supports the head of their cult. This opens up a larger discussion about political beliefs, and particularly extreme political beliefs. The left-to-right political spectrum is a flawed scale, but it's at least functional enough that we can talk a little bit about the things that people believe. So for the left, I'm on the left. I'm on the extreme left. Leftists generally, believe in a world of egalitarian politics. So everyone is taken care of, everyone is nurtured and provided for in such a way that society takes care of the weakest among us, so that we're all brought up to the same general level, we all have the same opportunity in an equal way. On the right, on the other hand, it's much more individualistic. So everyone is effectively set to fend for themselves. This is why a lot of pro-capitalist folks are on the right end of the spectrum, because it relies on market logic, it relies on economic logic to be able to make society operate. Particularly for those on the right, this means the undermining of social programs, so that it's borne on the cost of the individual to be able to pay for your own well-being. So if someone who's on the far right, or rather, someone who's on the far left would support Medicare for all, they would support a robust free education system, that sort of thing, versus someone on the far right would support for-profit healthcare and relying on the market to make the decisions for healthcare, as well as for-profit education that is invested in as a personal good rather than a societal good. But there's another scale to politics, which is the authoritarian to libertarian scale. As one might expect, someone on the authoritarian end of that spectrum is going to support someone like Donald Trump, for example, because he's an extremely authoritative guy. They also would support a very hierarchical mode of societal organization. So someone at the top is making most of the decisions, which then trickles down from one person to the next, down to the masses at the bottom. Someone on the libertarian end of the spectrum, on the other hand, rejects any and all authority. So they would not believe in the idea of a state. They would not believe in anyone having sort of authority one over another. So even the most extreme of these folks believe in the rescindance of laws at all. So they would allow slavery, they would allow murder as long as it is a mutually agreed arrangement. Now, on this spectrum, I am not an extremist in either sense. I certainly am on the libertarian end of that, but I oscillate a lot of the time on whether or not it's possible or even desirable to be completely without a state. I am generally an anarchist, and an anarchist isn't just desiring chaos or the overthrow of government. An anarchist is someone that rejects invalid, unjust authority, and that certainly does describe me. There are legitimate ways of using authority and using power to operate society. So, like parents exercise authority and power over their children in order to raise them well. That's just how we do it. You can't really raise a child effectively without any sort of authority over them. Otherwise, they grow up feral. The same can be said about society at large. We can use a certain amount of authority to help people operate in society, but it must be just. It must be informed by the practices of a just society. So if we're to compare and contrast what we saw yesterday with what we saw in last summer, you would have Black Lives Matter and Antifa on the left side of the spectrum, versus you have the people that we saw yesterday on the right side of the spectrum. Now, the weird thing about what happened yesterday, though, is that you've got folks there who claim to be libertarians, and in certain ways they are libertarians. They do reject the authority of the status quo. But on the other hand, they're very, very supportive of this extremely authoritarian, charismatic figure of Donald Trump. This is a strange paradox, it seems, that I've witnessed a lot more of recently. This is a common theme among collapsing democracies through history. What I see is going on here is that the identity of freedom, much in the same way that the identity as an American patriot is invoked, is used to convince people that giving over their freedom is actually the freest thing that you can do. It's a weird bit of mental gymnastics, but that seems to be how this is operating. Generally speaking, the culture of the West is quite individualistic, owing mostly to our democratic forms of government and the self-directed form of North American, particularly life. When we've got a movement growing of recruiting that sense of identity and sense of individualism into authoritarian rule, it's suggestive of a breakdown of democracy. It would be easy to just say that Donald Trump is a proto-fascist and we've dodged a bullet. That now the bad orange man has been removed from his seat of power and we can go back to normal. We can go back to our democratic form of life. But I don't think this is the case. Donald Trump is not the cause of the problem. He is not the problem itself. He's a symptom of a greater problem. There's been this steady undermining of democratic intelligence, democratic sentiment among America over the last generations that has culminated in this figure of Donald Trump. As America starts to return back to normal, i.e. the status quo, I think the same resentments that gave rise to Donald Trump will continue to build. And in another 4 years, or maybe even sooner, another figure like Donald Trump, who I think might be a bit more competent, may rise. And that's of great concern, because at the same time we still have these movements at the bottom increasing the extremity of political belief. Now, I'm not just against extreme political beliefs, because I think our acceptable range of political discourse is too narrow. We have laser-focused vision on keeping things exactly the way that they are right now, but the way they are right now isn't really working for everybody. Certainly not working for me, and probably you watching at home, probably not working very well for you either. The American people, during this pandemic, they've suffered greatly. They've had to stay home and shut their businesses, and many of them not work because of the risk of infection, but meanwhile, they haven't been compensated all that much. They've received a single check thus far for a paltry amount that can't even cover a single month of rent. And now, even though they're probably going to get a stimulus check coming, they're still not really going to be taken care of. Because America's pretty right-wing. Both parties of America are far to the right of center. They're not egalitarian parties. They may have the trappings of egalitarianism, they may have the trappings of democratic governments, but they're not really at their essence. So of course, people are angry. People are understandably angry. This is what leads to these extreme views. However, those who are participating in what happened yesterday, I think they're barking up the wrong tree. They see as the enemy the American people themselves. The people who don't support Donald Trump are the enemy, and Donald Trump is the savior, the one who will make things better. But no one person can make things better for America, no matter who they are, no matter what they believe. What instead might change things is if we just adopted an attitude of egalitarianism, to decide as a society that all people are worthwhile, all people are worthy of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, the things that America was founded on, and act with that in mind. Take care of people. Make sure they have enough to eat. Make sure they get a good education, not one that is dictated by the amount of money that they have. Medicare for all would be a huge step in that direction. Simply being able to go to a doctor when you are sick will change people's lives. But neither of the parties that are on offer is willing to give them that. If the solution to these problems can't be found at the ballot box, it's only natural. It's only understandable that people will go to other means. This is why we've seen so many protests, so much uprising in the last few years. And I think that's going to accelerate. And not in all cases do I think this is a bad thing. I think we need to be standing up. We need to be telling our representatives and our governments that we're not willing to sit back and watch while democracy is undermined and impoverished by capitalism. But if we're to have an egalitarian outcome, if we're to have a democratic outcome, it must be by the consent of the people. We must engage in dialogue with one another to agree upon a course of action. This is, in our current society, done by the ballot box, but our electoral systems just aren't capable of the kind of decision-making that we're needing. We're left with a choice of a couple of candidates every few years when there's this whole discourse, the whole realm that we can't even access by the ballot box. We need more choices. We need more access to the levers of democracy. And to get that, we also need a better informed, democratically thinking populace. And we need to work towards that. That is hard. It's very hard, especially when we're pressed to the brink. If one is working 40 hours a week and then some, and still struggling to pay for food, and also raising children, etc., it's going to be impossible for them to get involved in local government, or especially regional government or national government. We need an egalitarian society to get the democracy that we need for a more egalitarian society. I'm not quite sure how to get there, but we need to bootstrap this process somehow. Maybe you've got some ideas. I'd appreciate the feedback if you have any. Anyway, see you tomorrow.